Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Catholic Truth Podcast, where we teach and preach the truth that comes down over 2,000 years from Jesus and the apostles. Here at Catholic Truth, we want to help you to know your faith, love your faith, and live your faith, and even be able to explain and defend it. Lately, we've been getting a lot of questions from people because the canon of the Bible comes up a lot. I mean, it's a big issue. We say that Protestants took out 7 books of the Bible. They claim to be Bible only, lovers, but yet they took out 7 books of Holy Scripture. And there were other Protestants who wanted to take out more. And we say we have the full Bible. But then Orthodox come along and say, well, you guys have more books than Protestants. We have more books than you. And I say, okay, that's true, but that doesn't mean your books are correct. They weren't part of the original Bible canon. They weren't part of the original Bible down through the centuries. They were added on much later. And many Orthodox might even say that there's not even an official list. I've been told by Orthodox that they have 2 different lists, the official one that, matches what Catholics have, and then an unofficial one, which actually has more books. So we're going to unpack all of this today. And to do that, we have Bible canon scholar and historian, Gary MICHUTA, and he has been on this show before. If you haven't seen his other show, we have a full 1-hour show on where the Bible canon came from, everything about the canon, when Protestants took the books out, the reasons why, all of it. We're going to give a much truncated version today as we talk about the Orthodox. But I want to welcome you to the show, Gary. Thank you for joining us.
Hey, thanks for having me. Wow, with such an introduction, you make me sound important.
Yeah, you are. And if anyone doesn't know Gary, he has a book called Why Catholic Bibles Are Bigger, Making Sense of Mary, Hostile Witnesses, and his newer one of his new books, Revolt Against Reality. Gary, what's your newest book that just came out?
Yeah, it's called The Gospel Truth, How We Can Know What Christ Taught. So that's
Thank
by
you.
MICHUTA Press. Yep.
Great. Yes. And we'll have a whole show on that. But Gary, last thing I'll say is Gary has his own YouTube channel, and it's called Apocrypha Apocalypse. If you want to know everything about the Apocrypha and those 7 Deuterocanonical books, you can look that up. And he also has an apologetics show on Virgin Most Powerful Radio called Hands on Apologetics. So with that being said, let's get started, Gary, because, the canon of the Orthodox is very interesting. I want to start out just as like a aerial worldview, kind of looking at the whole picture really quick, and then we'll go into deeper detail. We'll back up and go deeper. But why do the Orthodox, just, quickly here, why do the Orthodox have more books in their Bible? When did that come about and why?
Yeah, well, first, Bryan, we're going to have levels of complexity we're going to be adding. First, there is no Orthodox church. There's Orthodox churches, right?
Correct.
Because there's lots of orthodoxies. You have autocephalous churches, several of them. So, and they all have, some of them have different canons of Scripture. So actually a simple question like just what you said actually isn't so simple. By and large, the ones that most orthodoxies have that Catholic Bibles don't have would be Book of Esdras, the Odes, 3rd, 4th Maccabees, and I imagine there's probably even a few more that could sneak in there. But those are generally the extra books that would not be found in the Catholic canon, but would be found in most Orthodox Bibles. So that's what you have.
Isn't that why they made the canon of Scripture in the first place? Because, people were adding more books here and there, and they wanted to know exactly which books were and were not inspired, so we could know which books should be read at the liturgy and which ones should not be. Because it's my understanding that they only wanted inspired books, biblical books read in the liturgy. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right. And that's the North African councils that were certainly influenced by Augustine. And Augustine's methodology is to look at all the churches and see which books are read in the churches, especially those known to be established by the apostles. So that's what Augustine gives in his On Christian Doctrine. And I think the North African councils did just that. They looked around, they saw, there are some locations where certain books are read, but as the church as a whole reads these books as inspired. And that's So I think that gives it even greater evidential value that these books were part of the original deposit of faith. But anyway, if we want to fast forward, and we Eastern Orthodox finally do come in contact with Protestants after the Reformation. In fact, I think the Orthodox kind of looked at the Reformation as a possible point of at least having a lot of points of agreement, since they denied the papacy. And there's a fellow called Cyril Lucarius. Cyril Lucarius later becomes the patriarch of Alexandria, and he travels to Europe, and he starts hanging around with the Calvinists, and he even sends some young Greek theologians to universities in Switzerland and Netherlands and England. And he becomes very influenced by Protestant theology. In fact, in 1629, he writes his confession. Okay, and so this is a confession of faith, in which he espouses all sorts of tenets of Calvinism. Okay, and now, which is pretty shocking, because this guy's patriarchal status, right? He's making this confession where he adopts certain Calvinistic understanding. And in that confession, he also adopts the Protestant canon of the Old Testament. Okay. So, let's see. I could go into details on that, but nevertheless, it's published in Geneva in 1629. It's published again in Greek in 1633. And the East reacts to it. Okay, so this is kind of like what Trent was going through with the Protestants. This is kind of like the Trent experience for the Orthodox. So they have to deal with this confession. So a series of synods. There's a synod in Constantinople, actually two, that condemn the confession. A synod Jassy in 642. And then the most important one is the Synod of Jerusalem, which is headed by the Patriarch of Jerusalem in 1672. So again, this is long after Protestantism's already undergone, they've established, they're growing in Europe. And it's in this council that the Confession of Dotheos is promulgated, and he addresses the canon. So I don't know if you want me to read it. It's a paragraph, but
you could summarize it of what he says.
Okay. Yeah, basically he says Cyril only accepts the books that were given in the Synod of Laodicea. That's actually a spurious canon, but nevertheless, the proto-canonical books. And he says that he did so foolishly, ignorantly, and rather maliciously. He calls them apocrypha. And so he then lists the deuterocanonical books. Interesting enough, he doesn't number the Maccabees. He just says the Maccabees. And he says, for we judge these also to be genuine books of divine scripture, genuine parts of scripture. And so this confession of Dotheos is, or Dositheos, is about as close as you can get to a pan-Orthodox affirmation, because the five patriarchs, Constantinople, Alexandria, Antioch, Jerusalem, and Moscow, okay, all of them sign on to this confession, which includes the affirmation of the canon given at Trent, essentially. Although, like I said, it is ambiguous about the Maccabees thing. So this becomes pivotal. And so the Greek church especially holds on to this. And with the other books that were floating around in antiquity, like I said, with the Apostolic Constitution and canons and things like that, these books weren't rejected, but they were just looked at as holy books. Okay, not necessarily full-on canonical. Now let's go to the Russian Orthodox Church. Their path is a bit different, because although they initially sign on to this, quasi pan-Orthodox confession, right, or a statement, they are being evangelized by Calvinists, and they undergo a lot of Calvinistic influence.
What year is this roughly? In the 1600s?
1700s.
Okay.
Yeah. And ultimately, there's a catechism that's promulgated. It's the Catechism of St. Philaret of Moscow, and it's published in 1823. Now, if you guys remember last time we talked about the canon, that's roughly when you have those Bible societies that have started in Europe, and eventually that becomes how they get rid of the books of the Deuterocanonical books and Protestant Bibles. Right around that time, you have this catechism. And the catechism basically reflects the Protestant canon. It rejects the Deuterocanon because it doesn't exist in Hebrew. And it kind of repeats Athanasius saying that these things should be read to proselytes, but not as canonical scripture. So Russian Orthodoxy takes a different tact. And there's a new book that's going to be coming out by Father Christian Kappas, where he traces exactly how this happens, that the North African Council canons weren't transmitted completely to Russia. He kind of argues that point. And
interesting, because I mean, North Africa, I mean, Pope Innocent was pretty clear, like, in 401, 405 AD, that these are the books of the Bible, and anyone who doesn't accept them is anathema, right?
Yeah.
And so, I mean, but if that didn't make it to Russia, then perhaps they didn't have the clarity that the rest of the world had, right? Perhaps.
Right. And then when the Calvinists come, they kind of, what are they going to do? They don't have that kind of rigid, authoritative pronouncement. But I don't want to speak for Father Kappas. He can go into the details for that. But interesting enough, though, Russian Orthodoxy kind of it wants to sign on to the Greek Orthodox canon. And in 1956, the Russian Bible includes the Deuterocanon in it. So it's kind of Protestant, but it's kind of leaning towards more of a Catholic Orthodox or Greek Orthodox understanding of the canon.
Interesting. So the Russian Orthodox traditionally accepted the canon, then rejected the canon after those 7 books after Calvinistic influence, and then kind of starting to accept them again.
Yeah. So it's So it's messy. Usually in these cases it is. And then, Bryan, this is something that you could use if someone says, yeah, but we have even more books, so somehow we're superior. Just point out that the Ethiopian Orthodox have 81 book canon. Which is a gigantic canon. I've tried to do some research on the origins of this canon. And quite frankly, there's hardly anything out there. It's not a lot we know about it. All we know is that the Old and New Testaments were translated from Greek to Ge'ez, I think, or Ge'ez, which is the ancient Ethiopian, sometime around the 4th or the 7th century. And so the whole Bible wasn't completed for the Ethiopian Orthodox till about the 7th century.
Wow.
So it's very, very late. And it's also somewhat disconnected from the rest of Christianity. So it's kind of an outlier to the evidence.
So you have some Orthodox that reject some Old Testament books. You have others that add a lot more Old Testament books. And just like, I guess that's what you said at the beginning of the show, different Orthodox canons have different lists of books, which is very interesting that it's not united.
Yeah. In fact, when you ask me which books the Orthodox have that we don't, it's like I gave you the short list.
Can't even answer that.
Yeah, because the Ethiopian church, they have the Prayer of Manasseh, they have 3rd Ezra, 4th Ezra. They even have books that no one else has, like the Paralipim of Jeremiah, which is 4th Baruch. They have Jubilees, Enoch. They have 3 of the Maccabeans, which has the name of Maccabees, but those 3 books aren't associated with the actual Maccabees books.
Interesting.
They have something that's kind of like Josephus called Josephus. And in the New Testament, they have 4 additional books. The 4 books of Synodus, Book of Covenant, 2 books, the Epistle of Clement, and the Didascalia. So it's an enormous canon.
Wow.
And yeah, and part of the problem is, and from what I've researched into this, is that there's no clear concept of canonicity within the Ethiopian Orthodox. So since they have a very fuzzy understanding of canon, it's not surprising that a whole bunch of books are included in additional to what we would call both the Orthodox and Catholics as canonical books.
Yeah. And that's very, very interesting. I mean,
Yeah.
across the board, it's very interesting. Because there's been, I mean, New Testament books. I mean, we just made a video on this channel, like maybe 2 videos back, and it talks about how, kind of the topic that Protestants fear the most. And I said one of those topics is the biblical canon, either because they don't know anything about it, or it gets them outside of Scripture. So they're very familiar with Scripture, but not history, etc. But my bottom line is that once you get outside of that, you have this authoritative decision made by the church. Whereas people like R.C. Sproul have said that the canon is a fallible collection of books of the infallible scriptures. And he calls it a fallible collection. Now, I think that sums up everything that you just said here today. I mean, the word fallible means capable of making error, not perfect. So if it's fallible, and who even knows, what could happen then? But then you have all these different canons floating around, some people adding, some people taking away, some people doing their own thing. And based on what, we don't know many times. But the bottom line is you have all these different things claiming to be the canon, when in fact, that's what happens if it's a fallible list. But we don't accept it as a fallible list, do we? We think it was done definitively by the church, don't we?
Oh yeah, yeah, absolutely. Since the 4th century, for sure, onward.
And again, I've read the Pope's writings on this. I even got into a discussion with a Protestant. He said, "Oh, the Catholic Church added the 7 books." I said, "Actually, the Protestants took them away." He's like, "No, they added them." I said, "Well, let's go back and look at the Council of Carthage and their writings. Let's look at Pope Innocent and his writings." And I showed him the 7 extra books. They're in the beginning. He's like, "Well, we'll just agree to disagree." And I'm like, "Well, we could do that, but you're disagreeing with actual history here."
Yeah, that's why I love it. It's not a subtle theological question. It's one of history. I mean, we have the documents. It's easy to prove. And not only researching from the Catholic evidence, but from the Protestants. You can see if Luther flip-flops on the canon, and he really doesn't solidify his view on the Old Testament canon until pretty late in the Reformation. And not all Protestants signed on to it, too. So, I mean, from both sides, from the Catholic side and the Protestant side, it's clear who's the innovator, right?
Yeah.
It's not the church, it's the Protestants.
And we brought up in that same video how Martin Luther rejected like 7 New Testament books, too. And not only, relegated 4 of them to the back of the canon and rejected James and Jude, but he actually said that people can make up their own mind on whether they think Revelation is inspired scripture or not. And I'm like, that's a fallible. I mean, as R.C. Sproul would agree with Luther, that's a fallible collection of books, but it's never been seen that way in Christianity. I mean, pretty much Christians have accepted the canon, minus some people adding to it here and there. But I don't, even so, I mean, I've heard, I'm going to have to research this deeper. I don't know if you know the answer, but if someone told me that the Orthodox have like 2 lists, an official list, which pretty much agrees with the Catholic Church, and an unofficial list, which is the one with more books, like that's not an official. I mean, how can it be anyways? You kind of clarified that they can't even agree among themselves.
Yeah. That kind of squares. I think that's, they're simplifying something that happens in practice. I think when push comes to shove, if you ask the Orthodox, what are the canonical books of inspired scripture, they would affirm what Trent affirms, right? As for the ones outside of Trent, they would say these are holy books. They're good to be read. They're associated with scripture. But if push comes to shove, they're not strictly canonical. And I mean, even Orthodox Bibles, for example, they will even put like 4th Maccabees in the appendix. So, yeah.
So it's kind of like the early church, where they read Clement, that people considered Shepherd of Hermas inspired scripture, Barnabas, and other books. But after a while, they said, no, these are holy books. There's probably no errors in them, but it's not inspired scripture. So yes, read them. They're good for edification, but they're not scripture. Is it similar to that?
Yeah, basically, yeah. Yeah, so there isn't an official two list or anything like that. In fact, there's very little that's official. I mean, outside of that Synod of Jerusalem, I think that's probably the most official that the orthodoxies could speak together on, And what they affirm basically seems to be a rubber stamp of the North African councils. Let me see really quick. 1672.
Okay.
Yeah.
And they basically accept the canon that was always accepted down through the ages.
Yep. All the patriarchs signed on to it. And so that's about as close as you can get. It wasn't a pan-Orthodox council, but it was a synod that all the patriarchs signed on to.
Very interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, it is. It's fascinating stuff.
Yeah. And you said at the beginning that, it wasn't a clear-cut answer. That there's no easy way to answer this question. And now that makes sense. Is there anything else you wanted to add about the canon or Orthodox, Catholic, or anything else?
I think it's important for Catholics and Orthodox and Protestants to recognize is when you look at the big picture and you're looking at what is accepted universally, ultimately it's the books that were stipulated at Trent. Those are accepted throughout, right? The books on top of that are generally they seem to be isolated in locations, and the Ethiopian Orthodox is definitely an outlier, right, to evidence for the canon. Think of it in terms of if you're doing an experiment in the lab, and the experiment comes out one way for, let's say, 99 tests, but it comes out the opposite on the 100 test. You throw out the 100 test, right? And that's kind of like with the Ethiopian Orthodox. It's definitely an outlier that's disconnected from Christian tradition on the canon. And even the Ethiopians, I've read several interviews with Ethiopian priests who basically say that we really don't have a sharp understanding of the canon, and we just have these sacred books. So, I think it's wrong to say, to cast aspersions that, we don't really know what the canon is, or that the canon's somehow open. A lot of these are historical accidents, and I think push comes to shove, we'd all affirm the same 7 books.
Yeah, and I think that's why Protestants often accuse Catholics, of adding 7 books at the Council of Trent, when in fact, I don't think that their historical understanding goes back very far, much farther than that, because Trent was just reaffirming those books. They didn't add them. They just reaffirmed. If we go back and read the African councils and what the Pope said, those were reaffirmed definitively a penalty of excommunication, like in 400s, early 400s, late 300s. And they were in all the Bibles down through the ages. I could see if they were, in, a couple Bibles, or if there was like major disagreement, but there really wasn't. And so I think Trent just reaffirmed those.
Oh yeah. Not only that, but previous councils also affirmed or used the Deuterocanon in their decrees and in their discussions as well, right? So it's not like these books weren't used as theological sources, even on a conciliar level. Some of them actually use them in their decrees. But it was just part of the church up until ultimately Luther, and eventually they're discarded. And like I think I pointed out last time I was on the show, the Anabaptists accepted the Deuterocanon. They weren't, they didn't go along with Luther on it. So did they add the books as well? Yeah. So it's like, did Trent and the Anabaptists add these books?
Yeah.
Or were these books always part of the historic Bible, and the magisterial Protestants got rid of them? I think the evidence is very clear. These 7 deuterocanonical books come to the fore, and it kind of runs from there, right? It's ultimately defined in a series of North African councils. They have Carthage, Hippo Regius in 393, Carthage 3 in 397, and then ultimately Carthage 419. So these North African councils become pivotal in the West. And I think that's really where things kind of start becoming, where we start seeing these other books coming into the coming into circulation. Because what happens is, up until this point, really Christians were just following sacred tradition, and some early Christians had to write list about which books the Jews accept versus which books we accept. So you have lists like from Cyril of Jerusalem, Athanasius, and so on. It was mostly Christian, Jewish Christian dialogue, right? We need to use the same books for apologetics. But by the time you get to the 5th century, there wasn't any definitive pronouncement on which books belong in the Bible till the North African councils. And part of that, those councils, is facing a problem that met the church in the West, and that's with St. Jerome. St. Jerome was commissioned to translate the Bible into Latin. That becomes the Latin Vulgate. And St. Jerome believed that the inspired original was to be found only in the Hebrew manuscript that he had. And he believed there was only one manuscript that goes back to the beginning. So he rejects the Old Testament Deuterocanon as spurious because of this theory of his, which, by the way, has been demonstrated to be false. And in the West, they were confronted with this issue. What is the status of these books? North African councils affirmed their inspiration, or the canonicity, I should say. Pope Innocent I also spoke to this. And so in the West, you have, since they were already confronted with the Jewish canon from the 5th century onward, that was what we were dealing with in the West. But in the East, of course, they don't speak Latin. They didn't use the Vulgate, so they didn't have to deal with Jerome's prefaces, where he called these books apocryphal. So okay. So here's what happens. Those North African councils become part of what's called the African Code, just a series of all sorts of disciplinary rules that were adopted in the East at the Council of Trello in 692, and tacitly adopted by the Ecumenical Council of Second Nicaea in 787. So, like Philip Schaff, who, by the way, is a Protestant historian who's very anti-Catholic, he says that the adoption of these codes was kind of like it gave the North African councils a quasi-ecumenical authority because of the imprimatur given at the 8th Ecumenical Council of Second Nicaea. So it was authoritative, right? These 7 books, and only these 7 books in the East. But it wasn't something that was super, I don't want to say pressing, because it really didn't come up in inter-Christian dialogue.
Right, like nobody was doubting it. No one was questioning it. This is just accepted by the church in large part, right? Like they only talk about these things when people start saying, well, I'm not sure, like Luther did.
Yeah, exactly. And you also have some interesting things that books kind of start being added on. For example, there is a book called the Apostolic Constitutions, which is a 4th century document that purported to be written by Clement of Rome, and it has canons in it. And in the canons, for the first time, you hear a 3rd Maccabees being included, and so there's weird intermixing in some of these documents. So
there's different canons floating around, different lists of books. You're saying by different people.
Yeah, and that's, like I said, the apostolic canons basically are they're not authentic. They don't go back to the apostles. They're part of a work that deliberately is a forgery, claiming to come from Clement of Rome. And Trullo, I think Trullo adopts it, if I remember. So it's like you have conflicting canons. You have the North African Code, and then you have the apostolic canons that add 3rd Maccabees. And you also have another problem in the East. I guess you could call it a problem. In the New Testament, whenever the Old Testament is quoted, the preferred text is the Septuagint. So most of the Old Testament citations are the Septuagint. That's an ancient Greek translation of the Old Testament. The Eastern Church, speaking Greek, just naturally adopted the Septuagint as part of the lectionary in which they preached, the Gospels and from Scripture. Well, one thing with the Septuagint is the Septuagint doesn't have an end date. So books were continued to added to the Septuagint over time. So you have books like Third and Fourth Maccabees being added. You have a book called the Odes, which is an interesting Old Testament book because it has a bunch of quotations from the Old Testament and the New Testament in it. And this was added like in the 4th century. So this becomes the lectionary of the East, and you have these books within the lectionary. So it's you have to distinguish where are canonical books in the Septuagint, which ones aren't. So again, that adds to the fuzziness of the canon.
And who was adding these?
It was just no one really knows for sure. It just we know some of them were definitely written into the Christian era, so they couldn't possibly be part of the Old Testament.
Well, that's what's interesting is that some of these books were added, 4th century, but I thought one of the criteria was that it had to be like 1st century, at least for like New Testament books and things like that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, what happens, like with the New Testament, that's a great example because you could have a writing that's not scripture, but it's held in esteem in a particular church. Like when Clement of Rome wrote a letter of correction to the church in Corinth, right? What is called First Clement. That was read from the pulpits in the church in Corinth, and it was referred to so much. Eventually, it was incorporated at the end of the end of the New Testament, and so you have in the church of Corinth a bigger New Testament because, over time that distinction between this is not inspired kind of wears off, and it's like, that's part of our Bible, First Clement. So so it's the latter.
Yeah, great. Well said. Any closing thoughts you have, or?
No, I just want to congratulate you on the great work you're doing on the channel. It's just fantastic. I watch it as much as I possibly can. And so just keep up the great work, Bryan.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate that. And I want to, point people to your channel, Apocrypha Apocalypse. If people want to know far more detail about these 7 books, and even why Catholic Bibles are bigger, he goes into extensive detail about everything, even though, Jesus quoted them and the canonicity of them and so much more. And everything's in there. So, I'll put all of that in the description section below. But I want to thank you for joining us on the show today, Gary, and for sharing your wisdom with us.
Oh, hey, thanks for having me on. It's been a blast.
Yeah, and we'll have you back again with your new book soon. I want to thank our audience for tuning in and this niche topic, and for sticking with us. And and it's an apologetics topic. It's a history topic. It's not one that most people would be interested, but it's very interesting. And we have been hearing so many Orthodox say, "Oh, well, you don't accept the bigger canon." Well, there's a reason for that because nobody did, and now I understand even further that there is no bigger canon. There's just bigger, biggest, among them. But yeah, very interesting. I found it all very interesting, and I hope everyone out there did as well. Please make sure to check out our description section below. You can follow us on social media, different platforms for daily inspiration. You can support our ministry so we can continue doing the work that we do, hiring people, growing, evangelizing people, and check out if you need a retreat. And you can hire Gary. You can check him out on his website. You can bring him in to speak to your parish. Or you can check out CatholicTruth.org and bring us in as well. Bring us both in together.
Yeah, that'd be a lot of fun.
Yeah, have a little mini apologetics conference. But anyways, put those thoughts in your head. All right. But we're going to be over and out now. Thank you all for joining us, and God bless you.